A gunshot shatters the stillness. A man stumbles, gripping his bleeding side. The Blackfeet warriors close in, their weapons raised. Meriwether Lewis is alone, bleeding out on the frontier. This wasn't how the expedition was supposed to end. He had been sent to explore, map the unknown, and shape history. Now history might end him. This is the real story of Lewis and Clark, the journey that changed America forever. The year is 1803. The United States has just made the biggest real estate deal in history, the Louisiana Purchase. For $15 million, the U.S. bought 828,000 square miles from France. But what did that money actually buy? Some believed the land was a paradise, filled with gold and lost civilizations. Others feared it was an empty wasteland. Even Thomas Jefferson himself speculated that mastodons, prehistoric elephant-like creatures, might still be roaming the land. But something more urgent was at stake. Britain, Spain, and native nations already had claims to the West. If the US didn't act fast, it could lose the land before even setting foot on it. Jefferson ordered a secret military expedition, led by two men, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Their mission was to map the new land, find a water route to the Pacific, establish trade with Native American tribes, and make sure Britain and Spain knew this was American territory. They set out with 45 men, 3 boats, and a promise to return in 2 years. Failure was not an option. While Lewis had been personally chosen by Jefferson, he knew he couldn't do it alone. He asked an old friend and seasoned frontiersman to join him, William Clark. Clark, though technically of lower rank in the military, would serve as co-leader in every way. His experience in map-making, wilderness survival, and leadership made him indispensable. Together, they would share command, responsibility, and danger, 2 halves of a single mission. Clark also brought someone else, York, an enslaved man who had grown up alongside him. York would carry supplies, hunt for food, tend fires, and stand guard like any other member of the Corps. But his role would evolve far beyond servitude. In the eyes of the native tribes they met, York's presence would become both a curiosity and a symbol, one that challenged the very ideas of race and freedom the expedition never dared to question. At first, the expedition marveled at the untamed world around them. They saw grizzlies larger than any eastern bear, millions of bison thundering across the plains, and towering redwoods that seemed to touch the sky. Unknown creatures, coyotes, pronghorn, and mountain lions were recorded in their journals for the first time. But the wilderness soon turned against them. York proved to be a crucial asset during these brutal early months. His strength helped haul the boats through the mud and wrestle supplies into place when others collapsed from exhaustion. His resilience under pressure earned the respect of the Corps, even if his freedom remained out of reach. In the journals, Clark often wrote of York's services, but behind the words was a man pushing through the same storms and shadows as everyone else, only without a name on the expedition's title. The Missouri River was relentless. Rowing against its powerful currents left their hands blistered and raw. In places, they had to drag their 2,000-pound boats through knee-deep mud, moving only 1 mile per day. Then came the mosquitoes. "It is impossible to describe," Lewis wrote. The men were swarmed so thickly that they wrapped their heads in blankets to sleep, suffocating in the heat just to avoid being eaten alive. And then came the grizzlies. Native tribes had warned them, but they hadn't believed the stories. They soon learned the truth. A grizzly knocked a hunter off his feet and chased him into the river. Another swam after their boats, closing in terrifyingly fast. It took 10 gunshots to bring one down, and even when shot through the lungs, the bears kept charging. But the dangers weren't just natural. One night, a sudden prairie fire swept toward their camp, ignited by lightning and fanned by fierce winds. The men barely escaped. abandoning gear and sprinting into the river as the firestorm devoured the grasslands behind them. Their journal entries the next morning were filled with scorched clothing and silent prayers. Then there was the hailstorm. Crossing the Great Plains in midsummer, the sky turned black in an instant. A storm rolled in, pounding the expedition with hailstones the size of fists. Several men were knocked unconscious, and their horses bolted in terror, shivering in soaked buckskins as thunder cracked above like cannon fire. Even the land itself turned against them. In the Badlands, their boots were shredded by razor-sharp rocks. The intense heat cracked lips and split skin. Waterholes turned out to be poisonous with alkali, sickening the men and leaving them vomiting and weak. Once, they stumbled into a patch of quicksand. One man sank to his waist before the others pulled him free with ropes and desperation. Then the first casualty struck. On August 20th, 1804, Sergeant Charles Floyd collapsed in agony, with no real medicine. Lewis and Clark could only watch as he died, likely of appendicitis, the only member of the expedition to perish, but the shadow of death lingered long after. By now, they understood the truth. This was no mere journey of discovery. It was a battle for survival. Every river bend, every mountain pass, and every whisper of wind could mean death, and they still had thousands of miles to go. The land wasn't empty. It belonged to powerful native nations, each with their own trade networks, alliances, and control over key territories. For Lewis and Clark, navigating this complex world of diplomacy was just as dangerous as braving the wilderness. Some tribes welcomed them. Others watched with cold eyes, seeing not explorers, but invaders. One of their first major confrontations came in September 1804, with the Teton Sioux, Lakota, who controlled a strategic stretch of the Missouri River. The Lakota demanded payment for passage, customary in their territory. But Lewis and Clark, sent by a young American republic that claimed ownership of the land, refused. Tensions exploded. Warriors surrounded the expedition's boats. Muskets were raised. Lewis, his hand on his sword, prepared for the worst. Only the intervention of Chief Black Buffalo, who calmed his warriors and hosted a reluctant peace, prevented bloodshed. But trust had not been earned, only bought with thin smiles and mutual suspicion. Later, with the Arikara tribe, diplomacy faltered again. After a friendly meeting, misunderstandings over trade quickly turned hostile. The Arikara, wary of American intentions, refused to let the explorers continue until negotiations were painfully drawn out. Armed men stood on the riverbank, watching every move. At night, Clark ordered guards doubled, fearing an ambush. But it wasn't all standoffs. In October 1804, the expedition reached the Mandan and Hidatsa villages in present-day North Dakota. Unlike the Lakota, these tribes welcomed Lewis and Clark, seeing them as a counterbalance to their enemies. The Mandan were sophisticated traders with established contact with French and British outposts. They offered shelter, food, and crucial intelligence about the land ahead. It was here the expedition met Sacagawea, a teenage Shoshone woman who would soon change the course of the journey. Even in moments of peace, danger loomed. Sacagawea was 16 years old, pregnant, and living among the people who had kidnapped her years earlier. Her husband, a French fur trader named Toussaint Charbonneau, was hired as an interpreter. But it was her the expedition needed. She gave birth on the journey in the dead of winter. Months later, when the expedition needed horses to cross the Rocky Mountains, they reached the Shoshone tribe. The chief stepped forward, then froze. He was Sacagawea's brother. Thanks to her, the expedition got their horses and survived. Without her, Lewis and Clark would have never made it. During the winter at Fort Mandan, rumors of a planned attack reached the expedition. A band of Assiniboine warriors was reportedly gathering nearby, possibly to ambush them for weapons. Lewis and Clark, uncertain if the threat was real or part of tribal feuding, prepared for a siege, keeping men armed at all hours and rationing their powder. Later, while crossing the Bitterroot Mountains, they reached the territory of the Flathead and Nez Perce tribes, both of whom had reason to fear strangers. When the Nez Perce first encountered the exhausted, half-starved men, their warriors debated whether to kill them outright. It was an elderly woman, herself once captured by whites and returned safely, who persuaded the chief to spare them. That moment of mercy changed everything. The Nez Perce not only spared them, but later helped them survive the harsh mountain crossings. York was not just noticed, he was revered. To many native tribes who had never seen a black man, York seemed almost supernatural. Some believed he had spiritual power. Others honored him as a warrior. His strength, dignity, and bravery often impressed tribal leaders just as much as Lewis or Clark. At one council, native elders asked if he was the true chief. The irony was painful. York was admired as a free man on the frontier, but enslaved by law back home. But the cost of these encounters wasn't measured only in trade or treaties. It was written in the minds of the men. They were always watched, always judged. In every new village they were aliens, strangers with strange clothes, strange tools, and strange intentions. The constant uncertainty took its toll. Lewis in particular began to show signs of inner strain, mood swings, restlessness, and bouts of deep melancholy. His journal entries shifted from wonder to worry. He second-guessed decisions, questioned loyalties, and confessed his fear of making a mistake that could doom them all. Every handshake was a gamble. Every word through an interpreter could carry the wrong tone. They knew one misstep could spark a war, and the weight of that knowledge was crushing. They were not just explorers, they were representatives of an expanding empire, sent to plant a flag in lands already claimed by others. In quiet moments, the men spoke of home, of wives, children, farms, things that no longer felt real out here, where diplomacy could turn to death in a heartbeat. After 18 months and 4,000 miles, the expedition finally reached the Pacific Ocean in November 1805. But there was no celebration. The Northwest Passage, the water route they had spent 2 years searching for, didn't exist. Winter forced them to build Fort Clatsop, where they endured constant rain for over 100 days, leaving them soaked, sick, and starving. Unlike the Mandan, the local Clatsop and Chinook tribes expected trade, but the expedition had little left to offer. Food ran out, and they survived on dogs, candle wax, and whatever they could find. Despite their misery, they mapped the coast, documented native cultures, and recorded new plant and animal species. But by March 1806, facing starvation and desperate to return home, they abandoned the fort and began the dangerous journey back east. They had charted the land and made history. But at what cost? And perhaps the darkest moment came not from an enemy, but a betrayal of trust. A tense encounter with the Blackfeet tribe turned violent. At first, the meeting seemed friendly. The explorers camped with a band of Blackfeet warriors, but when the tribe learned the Americans had promised guns to their enemies, the Shoshone and Nez Perce, everything changed. That night, the Blackfeet tried to steal weapons from the sleeping men. A struggle broke out, knives flashed, shots rang in the dark, and 2 Blackfeet were killed. It was the only deadly conflict of the expedition with native tribes. Lewis, shaken and bloodied, fled with his men into the wilderness. They had traveled thousands of miles, charted unknown lands, and survived nature's worst. But in the end, what haunted them most wasn't the mountains or the bears. It was the silence that followed a gunshot. The look in a chief's eyes when trust snapped. The sense that they had crossed a line and could never go back. In September 1806, they returned to St. Louis as heroes. Cannons fired, crowds cheered. The cause of discovery had done the impossible, mapped a continent, survived the unknown, and lived to tell the tale. Behind closed doors, Lewis changed. The man who once stood tall against grizzlies and negotiated with hostile tribes now wandered in silence, plagued by bouts of depression and erratic behavior. Some said he drank too much. Others whispered of sleepless nights and long stares at nothing. The constant pressure, the decisions made on the knife's edge, the faces of men he could not save, the question of what he had truly done for his country, all of it followed him. He was given a governorship in the Louisiana Territory, but instead of power, he found isolation. Letters went unanswered. Friends drifted away. By 1809, 3 years after returning from the edge of the world, Lewis set off on a journey to Washington, carrying his journals and reports, his last hope of reclaiming purpose. He never made it. In a lonely inn along the Natchez Trace, he was found dead from a gunshot wound to the head. Was it suicide or murder? Even now, the question lingers like an echo in the wilderness. William Clark, unlike Lewis, lived to see his legacy shaped in bronze. He became governor of the Missouri Territory, a U.S. superintendent of Indian Affairs, and an architect of westward expansion. But his choices, too, left complex shadows. He denied York's repeated requests for freedom. Years later, he would claim to have freed him, but no records prove it. And York reportedly died in obscurity. Clark did name a son after him, as if trying to preserve the memory of the man he once owned, but never fully honored. Sacagawea vanished into history. Some say she died young. Others say she lived to old age, far from the land she helped reshape. Her voice, like so many others, was never recorded. The expedition opened the West, but for whom? The maps were redrawn, trade routes established. America surged westward in their wake. But in that surge came broken treaties, stolen lands, and shattered nations. Lewis and Clark didn't cause it all, but they lit the torch. And Lewis perhaps was the first to be burned by its fire. So now we ask you, not just as students of history, but as witnesses to its shadow, was it worth it? The Lewis and Clark expedition expanded America's borders. It charted rivers, named mountains, and lit the path to empire. But it also opened the floodgates. Behind the triumph was tragedy. Behind the maps, the myths, and behind the legacy, the lives unraveling in its wake. Meriwether Lewis, a man once entrusted with the fate of a nation, died alone, with questions still hanging in the air. York, who had marched, hunted, and fought beside the corps, was denied the freedom he had more than earned. Sacagawea's story, so central to survival, was silenced by the very pens that praised the mission. This wasn't just a journey westward. It was a transformation of a country, of its people, of the land itself. But some doors once opened can never be closed. So we leave you with this. Is discovery still noble if it comes at a cost others must bear? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Because history isn't just about what we remember. It's about what we choose to forget.